What did I miss when we purchased our first small multifamily property? In my last video, I talked about what I look at when I pull up to a new property, and I start on the outside, of course, working my way in. And a lot of those things are similar. Last time it was a single family home, but there are a few differences when you're looking at small multifamily, which would be a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. And some of the similarities are, what are the grounds like? Is it built on a flat lot? Is there a slope? Is there a steep slope where retaining walls are required? Is there a big tree in the front yard? And if you go back and look at that video, you can understand why I don't like big trees in the front yard. But I think in this case, there were some things that I missed, and there were some things that my gut told me that we shouldn't buy it, but I didn't listen. So starting from the beginning, the property that we purchased was listed as a triplex. I've also spoken about how we shouldn't take everything that's in the listing for granted or for gospel. And this one was listed as a triplex. We purchased it from a turnkey provider, and the main issue to begin with was that it wasn't built as a triplex. It was built as a single family home, and it had been converted into a triplex. And so they added 2 units upstairs, and it had a total of 3 units, all 2-bedroom, 1-bath units. So one of the things right off the bat that didn't work out well was the flow, because it was built as a single family. So you walk into the entry, it had a weird entrance going into the bottom unit that actually went into a bedroom instead of a living room or something like that. Going up the stairwell, there were units to the left and right. Those aren't too bad. One of the things that was a little bit of an issue over time was moving furniture in and out, because the railings got in the way. They were a little bit tight for sofas and things like that. The other big thing that, and this is one that I didn't listen to my gut about, was it only had 1 furnace. And that furnace was controlled by the downstairs unit. So the comfort levels in the upstairs units, those tenants were not able to control those things. And that became a big issue over time, and it affected our vacancy rate. People weren't staying because of that. And that one cost us a lot. That cost us about $15,000 to add mini splits to each of the upstairs units. And during that time, we also had to reinstall wall furnaces that were in the units and had been removed. And the reason we needed to add those back in was because in the Midwest, this property is in Missouri, and it does snow and get very cold. Maybe 1 or 2 weeks out of the year, it's so cold that the mini splits are not effective and they can't operate in those really cold extremes. So the wall furnaces were backup heat sources. So altogether, I think it ended up being around $17,000. One of the things that has been a challenge, this property was built in 1904, I believe, and that's not really an issue. I think properties built then were built very well. A lot of the things that might come into play, and maybe I've mentioned them before, but this property had knob and tube wiring, which can come up when you go to get insurance on the property. A lot of insurance companies won't cover properties with knob and tube these days. And even aluminum wiring, which was popular in the 60s and 70s, I believe. I've run across companies that don't insure if you have aluminum wiring too. So those are some things to watch out for. The plumbing is typically very old, cast iron or clay, and honestly, that's over 100 years old. So if those systems haven't been updated, that's something to take into consideration. And it doesn't mean that you would automatically pass on the property, but you need to plug in numbers for what it's going to cost to update those systems. And put those numbers into your analysis of the property and make sure that it still works. A couple of the other things to consider on small multifamily, as we've experienced with this property, is the utilities, because they do have separate electrical meters, but they don't have separate water and gas meters. So in this case, we pay the utilities and then get reimbursed from the tenants for those bills. Newer buildings, they're doing a better job at separating everything. So if we were able to do this again, I would definitely search for a newer property that already had those separated out. Makes it a lot easier. And for that reason, I think I'm leaning more towards buying single families, because the other thing with small multifamily is snow and lawn care. So snow removal and lawn care are something that the landlord typically has to pay for on small multifamilies. But on a single family, the tenant takes care of that. And also on a single family, the tenant pays all the utilities. So I like that simplicity. Some people have different opinions. They like, which is true, they like the fact that a 2-unit or 3-unit building, if you have a vacancy, the other units can carry and pay the mortgage until you get that third unit filled, which is really nice. And we've enjoyed that experience ourselves. One of the other things to consider is parking. A lot of times on small multifamily, it's got only street parking available, which could have an effect on rentability. If some of the people that we know in the investment community like to buy single level duplexes or triplexes that are separated by garages, and I can see why, because there are fewer noise complaints. In our triplex, we haven't really had noise issues, but there are people living upstairs, so that can be a problem in some areas. If your property is single level, separated by garages, noise doesn't typically come up, and typically they have dedicated parking for each unit, which is really nice. And I don't really put too much weight in the fact that some investors think if you have 3 units in one building that it's easier to maintain because there's only one roof and things like that, but I don't see that as a big benefit. The other thing that we have had to look at with our properties, we do have a duplex also in Milwaukee, and that one is a newer home, relatively newer. It was built in 1976. So one thing we ran into on the triplex is, because it was a really nice looking older building, but it was still an older building, and it was a little hard to compete with other rentals that were available in the area because they were newer homes, had newer finishes, maybe nicer finishes. So that came into play when we were trying to rent our units. They sat on the market a little bit longer for that reason. We've always gotten them filled. Sometimes it took a month and a half or 2, but those tenants now have been in place for a couple of years. So I think the improvements that we've made to the building have helped a lot as far as lowering our vacancy rate. I don't know that there are too many other things. Obviously, you're going to get inspections and rely heavily on those inspections for your major systems like your heating and cooling systems, water heaters, and again, the electrical and plumbing. I would really dive deep into that. And if you are in an area where you can drive to the property or go see the property at least, I would recommend that now, because we haven't seen any of our properties in person yet. And it hasn't really been a big factor, except for the fact that we don't really know the feel of the property. Like I said, the layout in the triplex. If I had gone to see that in person, I probably wouldn't have bought it. So if you're thinking about buying a small multifamily or even a single family, it doesn't matter. That's one of the reasons that I started offering clarity calls. If you have questions and these videos aren't answering enough of those questions, I do have a call that you can book. It's a 30-minute Zoom call, and we can go over your questions, and I can share our experiences, and hopefully it will clarify a lot of the things that you're curious about or things that might be holding you back. I'll put the link in the description to book that call. I also have a free rental reality checklist, which is more of a mental checklist to help you understand if you're ready mentally to get into this business. And, I always say I'm not trying to talk anybody out of getting into buying rental properties, because we've been at it again for 6 years, and we still believe that it can help us in retirement. So my wife and I are stabilizing what we have now, and hopefully that will turn into income that can help us once we do retire. So hopefully this brought some value and answered a few questions. If you have other questions, please put them in the chat or in the comments, and hit that subscribe button. I'm doing these videos once a week, and this is part of a 10 video series. So I'll link the playlist also, and we'll hope to see you on the next one.